Welcome back to the Steve Marchand podcast. Really happy to have you here again today. And if you are following New Hampshire politics at all, then there's a smorgasbord of major issues to talk about. But there's one this week that I really want to hone in on. It's as important as anything going on in New Hampshire right now, with one bill that's getting a lot of attention. But it is not the only element in public education that is making this arguably the topic of the year in New Hampshire politics and New Hampshire public policy. So I needed to have folks that were significantly wiser than I on the topic. And luckily, I'm really fortunate. We have two fantastic guests today who have shown a lot of leadership in what they do in civic life and even beyond. So I want to thank from Lebanon, Lil Mon, and from Dover, Michaela Demeter. Both are school board members in their communities, but are going way beyond the call there. And we'll get into that and talk about education in what seems like a pretty pivotal time in the history of New Hampshire public policy on as important an issue as we're going to get. Lil, Michaela, thanks for being with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
I want to warm it up this way, and you could decide who to start. There's, we're going to talk about a bill in particular, HB 751. That's at the center of the bullseye at the moment. But either one of you, grab this. Talk about the state of New Hampshire public education as it stands right now, the quality of it, where we stand maybe in the context of recent past and history, and where the debate on public education is centered these days.
Michaela, you should start.
I'm happy to talk.
Yeah.
So New Hampshire is really interesting. We are exceptional in a few different ways, and I don't necessarily even use the word exceptional to always mean positively exceptional. We are the exception in a few different ways. New Hampshire is one of the best funded states in the entire nation on a per pupil basis when it comes to education funding. On average, we're spending over $22,000 per pupil, and that generally puts us around, depending on the metric you use, generally around sixth in the nation when it comes to how well funded public education is. And our student proficiency scores also show that in general, we are one of the highest performing states in the nation. Our neighbors in New England are generally the other top 10, top 5 people in the school funding and also the student proficiency rankings. So by and large, New England is, we do a pretty good job with education. New Hampshire is different than our other New England neighbors because we fund education generally from the perspective of focusing on property taxes. We don't have an income tax. We don't have a sales tax. And that means that in New Hampshire, because we are a community that has a lot of beautiful natural resources, some communities in New Hampshire are the haves because of where they lie proximal to ski mountains or to the ocean, or even to the border of Massachusetts in some situations, to Lake Winnipesaukee. And communities like that generally can offer their students a heck of a lot more than other communities, maybe in more economically depressed areas. So even though, by and large, New Hampshire is doing pretty great in the rankings, the average hides a lot of disparities. And I think that's a really important nuance that we can't forget to talk about when we're talking about public education in New Hampshire. Another way that we have, that we are exceptional and not necessarily in a great way, is that because we rely so heavily on property taxes, there is a wide disparity in how much each community spends on public education. And that can translate to what opportunities are available to each student. And then beyond that, we have a legislature that is making some decisions that not everybody agrees with. And so I think the climate in Concord is tenuous oftentimes, because there is really a struggle for what what education should be, the narrative of what education should be when it comes to communities supporting their community schools, the state supporting public education. And then the last way that New Hampshire is really exceptional is compared to all the other states in the nation, we fund education on a state level, the lowest percentage of the entire country. So to put it into perspective, the state average is, the national average is around like mid 40% of public education costs generally come from each state. And it ranges, of course, but New Hampshire is about 20% that's coming from the state. And that makes it really tricky because depending on the community you live in, you have an easier or a more difficult time funding that remaining percentage that doesn't come from the state or from the federal government. So there's all kinds of things at play here, but New Hampshire is, it's exceptional for many different reasons, good and challenging.
And I think just to add to what Michaela was saying, I think that this is all happening in the context of a national discussion about education and approach to education that is tenuous and shifting all the time and is changing the way that the federal government is funding education. And so even as we talked about our property tax payers and the sort of burden that falls on them, there's always been some federal funding, just like in every other state, there's been federal funding that we can count on, and it's been less and less available and less able to be counted on. And so that is also a shifting part of our funding situation. It's not unique to New Hampshire. That's happening across the country. But when it affects a state that already contributes the least of any other state to its educational burden or its educational costs, then you're left with the federal funding becomes even more important. And the lack thereof is felt even stronger.
Well, you're both currently on school boards, and Lil, you're the chair, correct? Right now, the Lebanon School Board.
Yep.
So because of what Michaela said a moment ago, the least state funded as a percentage of the cost in the country by a pretty significant margin. When a student, and I used to be, for folks that don't know, I was a city councilor, I was a mayor in Portsmouth where we had to make decisions on the school budget. And so we had our hands dirty. I used to audit cities for a living. And so I had to spend a lot of time on the topic as the scary guy coming in that had to make recommendations. So, but New Hampshire, when a kid moves into town, from a budgetary point of view, it's a little scarier to plan for changes in student population than probably any state in the country, because you're on the hook, town, for more of the change, the delta in the number of kids in your community than any state in the country, which will have some downstream impacts on some of these pieces of legislation we'll talk about. But how do you, both of you, maybe Lil, you first, how does that affect how you look at the community building, at the desire to have young families in your town, the vibrancy, the entrepreneurship, the energy that comes with having young families with their kids, knowing that more than anywhere in the country, it means more financial pressure the next year when you're putting a budget together? Do you feel that as an elected official, as a chair of a school board?
I think we feel it in different ways, right? We feel it because sometimes there are some costs, and you know this from your house, right? I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and my parents said that after 4, it didn't matter. 1 more kid, 2 more kids, 3 more kids, because you were just absorbing, your fixed costs were sort of the same, right?
Yes.
In a lot of ways. So there's a certain amount of influx that every school district expects and that every school district can handle, right? That's not really the question that HB 751 is talking about. This is not why people are upset. It's because we can't handle more people. Although we can't handle 100 more people, we could maybe handle 15. So there is a limit. And so we do think about that, but we also think about the schools themselves are so much the driver of what brings people to communities. And if you have a good school that people know is a good school, that people count on, that is a value, not just to your school and not just to the families who come in who have kids, but it's a value to the entire community. because that is what is bringing people there and keeping people engaged in your community. And so schools really, we feel that a lot. We feel that we are sort of the pulse of communities, and so we want to reflect what they want, obviously, as elected officials, but we also want to maintain what brings people there in the first place. And in a world such as ours, and in a world that's going to cost, there are costs that are built into that. And those costs continue to increase. Even if you keep services the same, costs continue to increase. But you don't want to keep services the same because you want people to come, right? You want to improve your school. You want to keep your school. You want to keep people there. And so you need to give them something that makes them stay. And so that's maybe the pressure that we feel a lot as school board members.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in Dover, which seems like a community in socioeconomic transition a little bit, that having lived in Portsmouth for 20 plus years, or we're in Northampton now, we would often have folks that wanted to buy into the Portsmouth real estate market and then took a quick look at the prices and said, still want to be in the Portsmouth halo, gonna look a little west to a Stratham or a Greenland, or we're going to go across the bridge to Dover, Somersworth, and so forth. So that's a dynamic that's going to probably change the population and has the potential to change the student population along the way. So I'm imagining in Dover, you're seeing some of the same things.
Yeah, I laughed when you said that, because that is exactly me. My husband and I, we moved to the area about almost 20 years ago at this point, and wanted to move to Portsmouth, and took one look at the real estate market and thought, Dover seems pretty nice. and that's how we landed in Dover. It's absolutely true. Yeah. And I think one of the big differences there are some, definitely some differences between Dover and Portsmouth, but one of the differences is our student population is a lot bigger than in Portsmouth.
Yes.
I think they're probably, double-ish the size of Portsmouth. And so for a community like Dover, and especially in a small state like New Hampshire, where we have, the two biggest cities, we have Manchester and Nashua, and then, and those student populations are, just north and just south of 10,000 students. And then underneath that, there isn't really anyone really close to those two. And then you have this cohort of about 10 districts, Dover being one of them, that are, Rochester's another, Salem, Derry, Bedford, Merrimack, a few other districts like that are all in this kind of 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 student range. And so for Dover, we have economies of scale because we're a larger community. And that makes a difference, to Lil's point about, when you build a building, like, you have the fixed cost of that building. And so for that reason, Dover can keep its cost per pupil a little bit lower. But that said, we're not completely immune to students moving into and out of the district. And I think especially so when you have a new student moving into the district with a disability, with special education needs. And when you have so much of what that student costs a community, a student of any ability level, costing the community, when 70% of that is coming from the local taxpayers, it really does make it challenging. And I think because we as school board members are community members living within our towns, and I have students who are attending Dover Public Schools, I am acutely aware from my own perspective as a taxpayer, paying on my own home and in my own community, that the decisions we make as school board members, they really do impact people. And it makes it especially tenuous at budget season to balance, to weigh the necessity for the cost of the things that we know are going to provide the best opportunity for our students to thrive, to succeed, to achieve the things that they want to do after high school in whatever form that looks, balancing that with the real challenge and the financial reality of our neighbors in our communities who are really struggling under the burden of this higher property tax. And I think that is the ever-present tension that a school board member holds. And in Dover, in particular, no, we are unique a little bit in a few different ways, right? We have a tax cap in our community, and also Dover is a city. We are one of the 13 cities in the state. So different than Lebanon, for example, but not different than Portsmouth. We, as a school board, we submit our budget to the city council, and then the city council has to approve it. Whereas in most other places, it goes to a vote at the town meeting. So there are just all these different ways that we as communities, big ones, small ones, and everything in between, we have to wrestle with how do we keep living in the communities we love, while at the same time providing the resources we need to support the schools and the students to help our communities continue to thrive. It becomes more and more challenging every year, and that's the tricky part.
And can I just add one thing? I think it's important to understand too that when I'm talking about, you asked, when you have students move in, we're always going to accept our Lebanon students, right? Everyone who moves into our town, we're obligated to accept them all. So we are counting on the fact that there's going to be people coming into our town. We know that we have new housing developments that are bringing people in. We know that we have new students. That's one of our things, that new graduate students and residents that go to the hospital who are coming in. We're always knowing that those kids are going to be there, and we always want to be able to accommodate those kids and bring them in and educate those kids who appear. And that is one of the reasons why some of this current legislation is so scary, because it doesn't allow us to count on being able to take care of kids already coming to our town that we know are coming.
One of the things that frustrates me the most as a policy guy is you'll see in the legislature, and you'll see it in both sides of the aisle, so it's not necessarily a partisan thing. It tends to rear its head in one place more than another, perhaps, is this connection between housing growth or zoning policy and the uniquely local-centric way that we fund public education. And so you'll have, at the state level, lawmakers will often say, I don't understand, per-pupil costs are going up. There's all this pressure in a state that's the second oldest median age in the country. We have a collapsing student population over the last 25 years, right? It was about 200,000.
In some districts. Not all
some
districts.
Oh, right. In some collapse. Oh, absolutely.
But
that's part of it.
Some
are
growing. So it's really important. That's part of the narrative that gets overshadowed a lot, is that there are districts that are consistently growing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Absolutely. Which complicates it further, right? Because there are some where collapsing probably is the right word, and there are others where it's actually net growing, which creates some difficulty in scale in certain districts, right? Certain parts of the state. And they go, but housing's unaffordable. So why don't we, I know that when a kid moves into a district in New Hampshire, it has more direct impact on your local property taxes than any other state's property taxpayers in America. So the lawmakers will look at that and somehow disconnect it from why certain kinds of housing are greatly undergrowing in their percentage of the pie, because there's such disincentives for local communities to have relatively affordable housing in clustered multifamily, 2 and 3 bedroom, working class family can afford it that has 2 young kids. That is a scary proposition from a budget point of view. And yet, if you ever want to have a younger population in the state, you would have to have more of that kind of housing in order to facilitate that kind of growth. And so you have to fix one problem if you want to fix the other problem a little bit. And those two discussions are largely occurring completely separate. I guess taking this a little bit to HB 751 for folks, and either of you could explain it better than I could. So I'll allow either of you, or you could take turns. But tell folks, before we get into the nitty gritty, because of the unique level of impact it could well have if it becomes law, truly generational, I would argue. But let's step back. What is HB 751, and where are we in the process of its deliberation?
I can jump in with that. So I think it's important to take a step back and think about the New Hampshire budget process as this 2-year ecosystem. We are in year 2 of a 2-year budget process right now. And so a year ago, when legislators filed legislation, a legislator filed a bill in the Senate called SB 101. The S stands for Senate, so Senate Bill 101. And that was a bill that introduced the idea of statewide mandated open enrollment. So to kind of start the conversation, the idea of open enrollment states that instead of a student, I'll use Dover, for example, and I'll use my kids. For my kids who are Dover residents, they are expected to and allowed to attend Dover public schools at no cost to us as the taxpayers, as the residents in that town. If I chose to send my child or to apply to send my child to, say, Portsmouth High School instead of Dover High School, I would need to pay the tuition of that. That is how it has been, for forever in New Hampshire. If I choose to send my child outside of my home district, I have to pay for it, whether it's a different public high school, whether it's a private high school. It's on me as the family member making that choice. And what open enrollment does, instead of saying, you, Dover resident, are going to send your children to Dover schools, it opens up the door to say, you, Dover resident, have the option to send your child to any public education program in the state of New Hampshire. And the specific details of that are really what set apart different states who have implemented open enrollment from each other. There are lots of different ways that you can implement this, but at its core, open enrollment says you don't have to go to the school in your town. You can go to any school in the state. That's hence the name open enrollment. So going back to our 2-year biennial budget process, right? So SB 101, it was put forward, and then it was we can say it was shelved in a sense, sent to a study in the meantime, and brought back this year in the 2nd year of the biennial budget process. And so it will go through another round of public hearings. It will go through another round of deliberations, executive sessions, all of the different components of what takes a bill from its inception to potentially landing on the governor's desk and being signed into law. That said, there has been this there have been kind of 2 concurrent processes, and all of this background is really important to understanding the kind of complicated nuances of this bill. There was a different bill that has been on the books since 1999, I believe, that says, hey, if a school district wants to, on its own, have its taxpayers elect to become an open enrollment district, they can do that. And this is not a new bill. It's just that really most nobody has taken advantage of it so far. A few years ago, the Prospect Mountain School District did vote to become an open enrollment district. So they said, hey, we're, and in fact, it's important to note, they voted to not allow any students from their district to leave the district. So they closed the door in that way. But they said, any other students who would like to come into our district, you can come in, and your school district can tuition you in to be Prospect Mountain students. So some students did that. I don't think it was many. I think it was a dozen-ish, somewhere around a dozen or 15 or 20. Some of them came from Epsom, and some of them came from Pittsfield. And maybe other districts as well, but I know for sure Epsom and Pittsfield only because Prospect Mountain sent them a bill, sent Epsom and Pittsfield a bill, and those other 2 school districts were concerned because they hadn't permitted or allowed their resident students to attend a district outside of their own home district, and it went to court. And in the end, the court decided through a long process and appeals and complicated legal matters, it was decided that those school districts did in fact have to pay the tuition to Prospect Mountain. And so that decision, I believe, it happened last year, sometime mid to late last year, summer or fall time. So that legal precedent was set. And from that point on, school districts around the state realized, hey, if that legal precedent is there, if we know that Prospect Mountain for sure is an on the books open enrollment district, then we need to set our own local parameters so that we can have control over the inflow and outflow of both students and therefore money associated with the students, to make sure that we are running our own local budgets with fidelity. So what has happened in the past couple of months, and I promise all of this relates. It's the background.
Big story.
The background. It really is important for HB 751. There has been such a years-long lead-in into this. What has happened over the past few months is, as these local towns are getting ready to have their deliberative sessions, to have their town meetings, to put certain questions on the warrant for their town voters to vote on, one of the things that has been put on many, many different warrants is this idea that the town is going to vote to become an open enrollment district, which then allows them to set the parameters of who can leave and who can come. And so in the process of designating yourself as an open enrollment district, it gives the town the option to, as Prospect Mountain did, close the door to any students leaving. And in so doing, to offer financial protection and stability to that district, to say we're not comfortable with the cost of the student leaving when the student leaves, because that creates too much budgetary uncertainty for our community.
Michaela,
so many towns.
Can I just,
go ahead.
Can I just interrupt
Yeah,
really quick? Just to add to that, so in the Upper Valley, we have several of our schools are sending schools to Lebanon. Grantham comes to us, Plainfield comes to us at different times. And when this all was happening, we met as Upper Valley chairs and superintendents, school board chairs and superintendents, and we talked about this potential for making ourselves sending and receiving schools for open enrollment, because it felt like this is already on the books. This court case has already happened. We must decide to do something. And what is the thing that we can decide, not only that protects our own budget, as Michaela was saying, but that also protects our neighbor schools, our neighbor towns? Because we felt like we were, if, for instance, Lebanon, who is a bigger school that is a high-ranked school, if Lebanon says, we're open enrollment and we'll take anybody, anywhere, anytime, come on over, that was going to cannibalize towns like Enfield, towns like Canaan, towns like Claremont, towns like Croydon, right? Other towns that were on our drive up to DH, to Dartmouth-Hitchcock, and we didn't want to do that. So not only did we set these limits, or try to set these limits, they haven't been set yet because our votes haven't happened, but we tried to set these limits following the law because we wanted to protect our budgeting system. We wanted to protect our budgets. We wanted our taxpayers to be able to say what they wanted in their budgets, but also we wanted to protect our neighboring communities. And so we all decided we're going to be accepting a very small amount of people and we're going to be sending no one. And if we all send no one, then it doesn't matter how many people we accept because there's no one to come. And that was purposeful, to protect ourselves and to talk about a loophole that exists in the law as it was previously figured out.
I mean, that's a very practical application of how this was working under a law, as you say, that was dormant. It was on the books for a quarter century, but with a few exceptions was not really getting used and probably not really getting discussed. And then once it peaked out, you realize if you don't get ahead of it, you could get where Epsom suddenly was, getting a bill that you didn't expect. So if I understand it right, much more recently, legislators who were looking to go all the way, looking for more of the Wild West style open enrollment, everybody goes where they want, everybody takes, just everybody go, everybody just, here we go. And if you got a car and you want to drive, pick your district, and by the, not a lot of notice. They realized that if they did not get a lot more proactive at the state level in mandating an override of this option, that effectively most school districts were going to end up where Lebanon and your neighbor communities are going, which is, okay, we're going to set the table the way that we wish, that makes the most sense. So they got very aggressive in the very recent past, which kind of brings us to where we are today, correct?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I had started out by saying, SB 101 the original open enrollment bill in the first half of this biennium had been moving through the process. But when legislators saw that communities were taking charge of their own local decision making, which really is,
Their job.
I would assert, as it should be for local taxpayers to make to vote locally and to make decisions about their local budgets, when they realized that this system was going to break down if local voters decided what they wanted to do, they took all the language from SB 101 and they inserted it into this bill that we're talking about today, which is HB, coming from the House side, so House Bill 751, which was a bill talking about opioids. It had absolutely nothing to do with open enrollment, nothing to do with education whatsoever. And the bill for open enrollment was essentially tacked on like a backpack to the end of that bill about opioids. And because that bill had already moved through the House and was moving through the Senate, in the process of it moving through the Senate, it was voted on. And the only thing that would need to happen at that point, just based on kind of the complicated machinations of the legislative process, all it would have needed was just like a straight up or down vote from the House to be able to go straight to the governor's desk. And at the point it was done, that process could have happened as quickly as 7 days after that Senate vote. Importantly, inserting the language into a completely unrelated bill, we call that making a non-germane amendment. It has nothing to do with the original bill language. Inserting it at that point was done very deliberately to bypass the slower, more deliberate process of going through a full public hearing, to allow the public to have input, to allow district leaders to have input, basically the end users of a really sweeping, dramatic change to public education, and would have potentially landed on the governor's desk that early without any opportunity for that public input. And that's what brought us to where we are, and I think why we're here today, because Lil and I and a few other people were really not okay with that.
So talk about that. So in response, many are called, few are chosen, perhaps self-chosen in this case, but hey, whatever, we are appreciative. You've been leaders along with a handful of others in organizing a pretty significant number, diverse in its geography, the political history, recent history, voting behavior of the communities involved. This is quite nonpartisan. It's beyond bipartisan. It's kind of nonpartisan when you look at the list of towns that have school board members and or administrators who've signed on. Talk a little bit about that process in a very short amount of time in getting a real bucket full and growing of people with the most skin in the game across the state to express the concerns you're talking about today.
So do you want, I'll start. I mean, so I guess.
Sure, yeah.
Go for it, Lil.
So Curtis Hamilton, who we had just, he's the other author of this letter. He's the primary author, actually. And he had reached out to you, Michaela, right? Originally, and said, I feel like we've got to say something. I have a draft. I have some ideas. What can we do? And Michaela had asked me to join them. And we all met through Michaela's organizing efforts earlier of getting a place where school board chairs could get and school board leadership could get together and talk about stuff. There was literally no reason to talk except for us to get together and discuss. This is sort of her brainchild, which was an excellent idea. And we very much appreciated it. And we had met through that. So we have Zoom meetings every month. We talk about whatever we want to talk about. And often it's legislation that's happening right now. Sometimes it's things that are going on in our individual districts that we'd like somebody to get some additional input on or feedback on, or an idea that we had that we wanted to bounce off people who know what we're talking about. So this group existed and we were participating in this group. And so the three of us already knew each other because of that. And so we got on to Curtis's letter, and we revised and we workshopped and we fixed what we got it to say what we wanted it to say. And then we started to use all of the connections that we had to get it out to people as quickly as possible. And one of those was our network that we created of school board chairs and members and leadership and the superintendents that were connected to them. And that's the first place we started. Michaela, we did a lot more after that, which she was instrumental in guiding us into the next next ways to organize.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Michaela, take it from there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think putting down thoughts on paper is a really important first step. And we worked really hard to make sure that the message that was written and curated really was representative of a few things. First and foremost, just the breadth of concern about what this HB 751 legislation and really any open enrollment legislation, like not just limited to this one particular bill, because we know still there's this other SB 101 bill that has identical language. So open enrollment language in general is concerning for a number of reasons. So we outlined them in that letter. And it was important to us to not just say we don't like this, but to give some specific illustrations. And I think this is where the benefit of having a really wide group of school board members and chairs and vice chairs from literally every single county in New Hampshire, from dozens and dozens of districts, big ones, small ones, wealthy ones, struggling ones, with very different perspectives and very different concern levels and types of concern about what open enrollment would mean for their district. It was important for us to represent the breadth of that in the letter. And so that's what we tried to do is, the letter is about a page and a half long, and it's titled An Open Letter on the Risks of Statewide Open Enrollment. And so as we started putting it forward, we made it available for folks to sign on. They had to either be currently elected school board members or school administrators. So that included superintendents and then other school administration level employees as well. And it was really exciting. I mean, let me think about this. The letter was written on a Thursday. It was edited by Friday. It was put out live Saturday morning. And I think we were up to multiple hundreds of signatures by the end of that weekend, within 24 or 48 hours. And it has just continued to develop momentum, I think, because it represents such a wide perspective, and people can get behind what the letter says, which is really, hey, slow down. This process needs a lot more thought and care into it. It feels rushed and it feels deliberately excluding of the necessary voices that will be so important for any implementation of a program of this magnitude to move forward successfully. And so one of the things that we did as we created the letter was we created a companion document, which is a list of unanswered questions. And I think one of the really neat parts about this process is, even though Curtis and Lil and I were the ones who wrote that letter, and once the letter was set, it was set. Because if you ask someone to sign on to something, you can't change.
You can't change it.
We're not changing it.
You can't change it.
Yep.
So that letter was set. But what wasn't set, what was continually evolving, was that list of unanswered questions. And we invited all of the people who were signing on to the letter to contribute to that list of questions, because the things that I'm thinking of from a Dover school board member's perspective, as somebody who's in a tax cap community, as somebody who does have, an in-house high school, it's completely different than somebody in a different district with totally different student population and parameters. So asking everyone to add their questions in, we're now up to the unanswered questions list is 4 pages long, single spaced. And it just highlights how many essential components of this legislation are still left unanswered.
Well, it feels rushed, as you both
rushed.
have mentioned this in different ways, and it is rushed. I think what's so frustrating, beyond the potential impact itself, right? There's that. Let's put that over here. Is it is not an overstatement to say that if fully implemented, this could be the most impactful piece of legislation if you think about its impact on property taxes, quality of education, on housing stock, right? And it would have impact on the cost of housing in communities, on the availability of it. These are 3 of the 4 or 5 biggest issues that most New Hampshireites say are their biggest problem facing New Hampshire. And of course, the umbrella of inequality in all of this, there's a lot of there are folks that definitely would be advantaged by open enrollment in the way that this bill is written, but there tend to be the folks that have the greatest number of resources. They would tend to be the folks that have a parent who have the flexibility to be able to drive reliably, 180 days a year, more or less. As far, if they can get there, the world is their oyster sort of thing. But for everybody who's not that, you're in this sink where the water is it's a vicious cycle that you see how this is going. And the rushed nature of it is so infuriating because can we pump the brakes? If you believe that this is a good idea as a public policy, then it should be able to withstand a little bit of scrutiny, a little bit.
And I think the speed with which we got signatures is sort of reflective of that, the fact that people do see this as being so monumental in change and so damaging to communities and to school districts and to public education writ large in New Hampshire. And so I think when people were able to see that there was something they could do, even if it's just, I'm going to sign this letter and I'm going to put in some super smart questions. I mean, the questions that people have come up with beyond the ones that we sort of started with have been so educated and thoughtful and all encompassing. And so having people who actually know this subject, who know public education in New Hampshire, who say, there are some real serious concerns that we have, and we want to articulate them, and we want to have those thoughts heard. I think that speed and that enthusiasm and that sort of level of engagement speaks to the fact that people feel like there's a lot to unpack here that's not being unpacked, and the effects can be so far-reaching if we're not careful about either how we do it or how we don't do it, right? That if we're not careful about those things, we're going to be suffering for quite some time.
I'm just realizing
Michaela,
also
sorry.
in the course of our conversation, I stopped short of really explaining what the bill itself actually does. As we started to talk about it, I realized, gentle listener, you might not know exactly what HB 751 does. And so yes, like it makes it available. It makes the opportunity to go to any public school in New Hampshire available to any student who resides in the state of New Hampshire. But there are some important things that come out in this 4 pages of unanswered questions that are essential for somebody who's thinking about, maybe for the first time, thinking about this legislation to understand. The first thing is that schools don't have the opportunity to say no to this. It is a mandatory program. Schools do not have an opportunity to limit how many students leave. So, for example, Dover has about 3,450 students in it. If we wanted to do a thoughtful rollout of a program like this, we might say, well, I think we could absorb perhaps up to X number of students. And I think we could absorb losing up to, Y number of students. There is no opportunity for a local school district to say, we can't financially handle more than a certain number of students leaving. There is no cap on how many students can leave. And so that makes it a real struggle, especially for the school districts who might be adjacent to a really popular, excellent, well-funded, well-resourced school district. The other really important part that I think is really gets at the concept of who is this legislation really for is the fact that parents who want to send their students to other districts, they are responsible for the transportation.
Yes.
students. And so there's the transportation piece that's on the family to provide that transportation. And then also, and I'll use Dover as an example, because as a larger district, we have a smaller per pupil cost. Our per pupil cost is under $20,000 on average. And then I'll use, for example, we'll make up an example, right? Say Concord. If I wanted to send my children to Concord, I know their per pupil cost is about $25,000. So the difference between Dover's cost and Concord's cost is about $6,000 difference. Dover would only have to send its per pupil cost to Concord.
Yes.
But Concord wants to get all the money that they need. And so it ends up being on the family, the parent, to pay the difference in cost.
And Lil, I want to mention something. And Lil, I know you want to jump in, but I prepared something. And on the video, this will be obviously, some of you may be listening to this, some of you may be watching this in the YouTube channel. I'll try to put this slide in. But something that at this moment, I just think is really important in terms of the mainstream of this debate. Reason, people know Reason magazine. It's kind of a libertarian, longstanding libertarian publication. They have a foundation. It's called the Reason Foundation, and they are big fans of open enrollment, as you might imagine. So every year they rank open enrollment policies of all the states. And this is one of the reasons why states get a big knockdown in their A through F grading system is this, and I'm going to quote it. This is just from about a month ago. The Reason Foundation, mentioned earlier, ranks states' open enrollment policies based on several factors. Their third most heavily weighted factor in the ranking is school districts being free to all students. They write, quote, tuition can be a major barrier to transfer students, especially when it costs thousands of dollars. Removing this barrier is an important victory for students whose families cannot afford to pay public school tuition. There is no partial credit for this metric in our ranking. These are the biggest advocates for open enrollment in the country. And they are saying, if you are charging tuition, this delta, this difference, Michaela, that you just laid out, it is a significant demerit in their ranking, because they say, in their own words, it makes it an unfair system. When the biggest advocates in the country are saying this is kind of borderline deal breaker for open enrollment, then what does it tell you about sort of the mainstream of New Hampshire elected officials, parents, voters, taxpayers? It's a virtual deal breaker right out of the chute. And yet it's a prime element of the bill.
And I think if you talk to people who are in favor of open enrollment, one of the first things they'll say two things usually. The first thing is, it's about the students. We have to think about the students, which I think is a false narrative. But secondly, they'll say 43 other states have some version of open enrollment. Now, if you start to drill down into that, only about 15 of them have something that's even close to what we're talking about here. But of all of those states, there's a difference in funding that's made up by the state. That difference in funding is made up by the state, and we are not proposing that. That is not being proposed. That is not a part of this legislation. The funding is not changing. The funding model is not increasing. The funding model is not changing. There's no funding that goes along with this. And so, yes, you're right. Not only does this increase funding and budgetary problems for districts themselves, it increases costs for families themselves as tuition and as taxpayers. So they're probably going to have to pay infinitely more than they would be paying under our current funding model. So it's inherently unfair to many, many, many people, and the inequities are large, but that is one of the great ones.
I mean, I'm sorry, Michaela.
If it comes down to, if you don't have the transportation, and if you don't have the potential difference in tuition costs, this choice is not a choice for you. And so if it's not a choice for everyone, then is it a choice if it's selective? And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people are really frustrated about.
Along these lines, and again, I'll put this on the video version in the editing process. I go back to Reason Foundation, because don't believe me, don't believe you, believe the people that are the biggest advocates for it, talking about how a system would not work well, even if you believe in the system. So I did some analysis involving their reasons grading. There are 22 states in their ranking that have at least that have more than 40% of their funding for schools being local. We're number one in the country. The highest percentage of our funding for schools comes from local. There are 22 states where at least 40% of the school funding comes from local. Of the 22 states in their chart, with at least 40% of the funding being local, only 4 have meaning any open enrollment policies, as you indicate, Lil, for real at all. And of those 4 states, 3 of them are no tuition for transfer students: Nebraska, Colorado, Florida. The only state in the country that funds at a high level on local level and that charges tuition is Kristi Noem's South Dakota. And it is the number one reason they say this, that it takes a system that they otherwise like and they drop it down a full letter grade, which in that ranking is very significant, because they recognize it is the only state that relies heavily on local funding, though not nearly as heavily as us,
Right.
and that charges tuition. They acknowledge in the ranking it's simply not tenable if you're going to make local governments foot the bill at the level half of what we do, 2/3 of what we do. This system isn't going to work unless theoretically you start covering the tuition. But if we start covering the tuition difference, well, then what we're really doing is avoiding the real elephant in the room, which is the fact that Supreme Court keeps saying, hey, you guys aren't funding education at the state level nearly what the Constitution for 30 years now we've been telling you is what you're supposed to do. So the way that they're addressing it, many, is not by reading the Constitution and adhering to the law, but by trying to change the game, shift the cost, shift the blame, shift the system, don't actually address the elephant in the room. So the last thing that advocates would ever do is try to cover the tuition difference, because that's the whole point for why we're in this conundrum to begin with, or at least part of the point. So again, even the biggest advocates acknowledge you could not have a state like New Hampshire do this kind of open enrollment and charge tuition without game-changing, absolute non-starting problems like the ones you're describing today.
Yeah.
So where are
I
we
feel
in
like
this?
Well, it feels like a full circle moment to me. It gets back to kind of your first question, Steve, like, what is the education moment in New Hampshire right now? And I think we can kind of go back to that question by asking the question, like, what is the end game of open enrollments? And I think the end game of open enrollment is to downsize some of our public schools. We have in New Hampshire a lot of small rural districts. And these districts, if, say, for example, they only have 150 or 200 students in the entire district, if 20% of them leave, that district essentially is potentially becoming financially insolvent. Yep. And if that's the case, and the district has to disband because, we have these building related overhead costs, we have insurance, we have electricity, things like that, building bonds. If the district becomes insolvent, then there is this consolidation end result of an open enrollment system. And I think for some people who are proponents of open enrollment, that is the desired outcome. And I have heard, it's not just speculation. I have heard some proponents of open enrollment outright say that is one of the end goals of it. But it is particularly tricky for small communities, because we know that schools are the heart of a community, and the ripple effects when a district closes are felt for years and years to come. And that's something that can't just easily be reversed, with a change in law or a change in administration or a change in anything like that, which is why it's so important to be thoughtful at the outset and to make sure that any decisions that are being made are done so with thought, with care, with input from the people who are actually going to have to pay for this, which is all the taxpayers, and for the people who are actually going to have to implement it, which is all of the school districts. I think if more people understood just what a financial liability it could potentially represent, I think there would be more public outcry, and that's our goal, is to help people become more aware of it.
I think picking up on two things, Steve, you said earlier, this is part of the larger discussion about education, right? Education in New Hampshire. And I think sometimes we start to look at these bills as if they don't affect each other, right? That this thing is open enrollment exists over here and it doesn't really affect anything that happens over here. But as you point out, it not only affects things in the education world like school funding, it affects things in the community world like housing and business, and all of these things are interconnected. But when you start to look at the bills that are happening right now in our legislature about education, they go back to what Michaela is saying. There is a real push to dismantle the system that we have. And I think we have to be very clear about saying that, because I do think that it's not a question of like, I want to make education better in this way. I want to make education better in this way. I think sometimes these are bills that are designed to make education in the way that we know it disappear. And that's an important thing to say. I think it's an important thing to look back at and to say the effect of this. What is the net effect of this? What is, as Michaela said, what is the point, right? Why are we doing this? Is it to improve education, or is it to dismantle education? And I think it's hard to make an argument that it's not to dismantle education if you put this bill with, for instance, HB 1815, where we're trying to redefine what education even means in New Hampshire, or past bills where we're trying to redefine what subjects people should even teach in public schools. All of those things are of a piece, in my mind, about dismantling this as much as possible and not really suggesting anything in its place.
That's a great point. And there are so many pieces of legislation. We live in a time, certainly over the last decade, I realize my daughters are 22 and 20, and they're politically very engaged. Our whole household is. And they don't really know the before times. So their world begins in the mid 2010s. And so for them, that is the context of what politics, certainly at the national level, is. And I tried to explain to them that it was not always quite like this. This is an interesting time to be nice about it. But I look at, New Hampshire, depending on the town, barely 20% of homes in many communities have a school-age child currently living in their household. Partly people are waiting longer to have kids. People are having fewer kids. We're getting older. There's a lot of reasons for this. But and sometimes I find it to be almost a minor miracle, and it gives me some lift at moments when I get frustrated at this, what I think, Lil, you described accurately as this fundamental attack on the idea of public education writ large, that despite the fact that a town may only have 20 to 25% of its homes with a school-age kid, who you can imagine understand in the most visceral way why public education matters right now, next year, the year after, that there's still this other 30, 40, 50% beyond that of folks who don't have a school-age kid in New Hampshire, typically because they've aged out. Their kids are already out of the house. And you could see a world where they could be convinced, hey, listen, you got yours. You don't need it anymore. It's all good. Vote against spending. Vote against public education. And yet, in many communities, we see some of the most, awesome advocates being folks who've been through it and say that public education is big. It's a community thing. It is at the center of how we define community. It's about the idea of paying it forward. It's about, I'll tell you, and it's something that for my wife and I it's an emotional moment. We have two daughters. One of them was just flying through school, straight A, everything. And when I was mayor, there was somebody I know who was, I would frankly describe as pretty progressive in the big picture of politics, who privately said to me once, man, it is so frustrating that a handful of special education kids, a couple percent of our student population, are responsible for for so much of the spending because they cost more. Special ed kids typically cost more than kids that are not special education, that don't have an IEP, an individual plan. And I'm like, well, that's the community, right? Like today it's your neighbor's kid. Tomorrow, fast forward a number of years. And when that happened at a time when my kids were under 3 years old, I was mayor at a very young age. Years later, one of my kids ended up needing an IEP, having a lot of struggles, special education. And by the way, not cheap, totally acknowledged that, but received what I would describe as life-saving, literal and figurative services that have now put our daughter on a trajectory that was unimaginable 5 years ago. That is because, and we are deeply appreciative for it, the investment of our neighbors. When that friend of mine said, oh my God, the special ed kids cost so much money. And I kind of recoiled because it's so antithetical to what we're trying to do here, I'd like to think. You never know when it's your house that's going to need the fire department, when it's you that might be accosted going for a walk, that when it's your kid who might need special education services. Like only through the grace of God is it not us on a given day. When we get away from that mindset, the building block of what community is, and we go to you're on your own, which is what this open enrollment bill seems to be, we lose so much more than even the really bad parts of kids losing educational opportunity. I think we lose something much bigger, Lil, to your point a moment ago, and Michaela, what you've been saying throughout. And it's exciting. I had a chance to look at some of these questions that you're referring to. I ran out of time because there's so many friggin' questions.
Right.
I mean, what is capacity? Is it seat count? Is it fiscal? Is it personnel? Bureaucracy. If your kid has an IEP and they go to another school, okay, so now do we have double the bureaucracy in terms of special ed coordination? Who's determining this? Like
you do. Yeah. You do have double the bureaucracy.
That's crazy. And like at a time, you want to talk about driving up cost. Like, I mean, there's so many questions beyond the obvious ones. And so I guess, a question I'd have for both of you as we conclude, what can people do? As you said at the top, there's this committee of conference. It is not official as of this taping. It has not been formed yet. They have not deliberated yet. Once they do, it could be very quick. It could be a matter of days. It may lead to nothing. It's possible. Governor Ayotte has indicated publicly anyway, some ambivalence about her comfort level on this, which means, it's an important moment to communicate. What are things that people listening can do to try to have positive influence on putting the brakes on this before it goes any further?
I think there's a lot of things. There's the things that people always say, right? The answers, like talk to your legislator. But I think actually really do talk to your legislator, especially if you are in a less progressive town or district. Or for instance, one of the things that we did was we sent this letter to a whole host of people, but we sent it to people Republican representatives who had voted in favor of local control in the past. And then we followed up with phone calls and talked to some of them directly. And several of them were just, thanks for playing, but I'm for it. I'm not gonna have this conversation with you. But many of them had no idea what this would mean. They had no idea what the language implied. They hadn't thought about the questions. They hadn't thought about the ramifications. They hadn't thought about what it can mean for their particular towns and their particular communities. And even just having 5-minute conversations with some of them was so revelatory for them. I don't know if it changed their opinions. We know in a couple places it did, but just having the conversations, I think, is so, so important. So contacting people, even if it's with email, to say what your perspective is, why you are concerned, especially as a parent and as a taxpayer, I think is really valuable, because the more that people hear individual specific concerns and individual specific stories, like you were just saying, your story about your daughter, those are the stories that people need to hear. Those are the stories that convince people. And so really communicating those stories in any way you can, phone calls, emails, reaching out, conversations in the supermarket. I think that's really important. And as we have seen, can have real effect because it can delay things and get people to start thinking about this a little bit more. And I think that's the best thing to do, is to really talk to everyone, and not just your representatives, although that's important, but also your neighbors, right? And also your friends on Facebook and your friends on Insta, like talking to people so that they actually know what it means to you, what this would mean to your community, I think is so, so important.
Yeah, Michaela,
Yeah.
anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say absolutely. I second everything Lil said. And then, contact the governor as well.
Yes.
I think that's a really important thing to do.
Yep.
In the end, Governor Ayotte is going to be who stands between a bill passing and not passing, if it makes it as far as her desk to begin with. So, there are steps ahead. There's this kind of odd convening that is called a committee of conference, and we have every expectation that the bill will move into a committee of conference to get workshopped, essentially, and then whatever comes out of it will have to go back through the House and the Senate again. So it is on a longer journey now, and I would say the groundswell of opposition to this bill is directly responsible for, and it's not just us, but we play our part, and lots of other people played their part as well, in this groundswell of opposition, of concern, and of understandable questioning. It has delayed the process, and I think really importantly so. So we have some time, and so I would implore people who care about this, either from the taxpayer perspective or from the education, the sending my kids to school perspective, use the gift of this time that we have, however many weeks it is, before this bill really makes some headway, and contact your legislators, contact the governor, express from your own perspective. I think the perspective from many different people in many different positions around the state is going to be especially important here.
That's all fantastic. One thing I would add is if you go to my Substack, which is stevemarchand.com, I put up a column yesterday. There's a lot of work I do that the name of the column in particular that is very much pointed at this is called a 4-minute column about a 2-minute action. And it basically targets what I and my cohorts have identified as about 30 legislators who, either because they're in key swing districts in the House and Senate, and thus perhaps politically a little more sensitive, or because they have exhibited this year real independence on education-related issues, on other bills that we didn't even really touch on today. It could do a whole nother podcast about, but have shown a real independence and open-mindedness in a nonpartisan way, which is refreshing. And we need to applaud that regardless of the letter next to your name. And they have done that this year. So I would urge you, we've gotten it in a way so that if you click, you can sign up for it. It's all free, and it will have specific language representing the values and the language and the political affiliations and the names of everything of every precinct in New Hampshire. It is specific for each one. Some will be about the legislators. Some will be simply, as Michaela said a moment ago, contact Governor Ayotte, and don't be a jerk about it. Respectfully, make the case. Hopefully this podcast today has presented, and I have tremendous gratitude to Lil and Michaela for their articulate and informed way of making that case. And there are many other resources as well. And we'll try to put some of those links, including the letter that was referred to several times. We'll put that in the various ways on our YouTube channel, the podcast, and other places. But there's a little bit of time, but it's days and maybe weeks, not months or anything. So once you get this, take a few minutes, and it's certainly worth it, because the impact is hard to overstate. It is generational in nature, and it's critical whether you have kids in school, or you might someday, or you did once upon a time. There's a lot of reasons why it matters, and we're really lucky to have great people like Lil and Michaela willing to put it on the line and lean in on it at such a critical time. So Lil Mon, Michaela Demeter, so appreciative. We'll definitely want to stay in touch as we move forward. And I really appreciate your time, your expertise, and your passion for something so important. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much
Thanks
for having us.
us.
I really appreciate it.
All right. And thank you all for listening. Again, Steve Marchand. You can listen either on Spotify or Apple, iTunes. You could go on our YouTube channel for the Steve Marchand podcast. If you like sports, you can also listen to By the Numbers, which is for our non-political people, a way to get you interested in different things, an analytical approach to sports. And then maybe you'll stay for the politics while you're at it. And then, of course, stevemarchand.com, the Substack. If you enjoyed this conversation, it means you probably would like that too, because it gets into the weeds of policy and politics in New Hampshire in a way that if you stuck with us this long, I bet you'll like that too. Thanks again for listening. We will see you all soon. Goodbye.